We have already seen the teaser in the previous lecture. Now let's just start making that backdoor from this lecture onwards. So first of all, I have opened my PyCharm in the server side. So this is basically our Kali Linux. So in the Kali Linux, which will be our server, so let me just create a new Python file. So let me say this is the backdoor, and now we have created now backdoor file in this Kali Linux. So you can clearly see this is my Kali Linux, which is server side. So let's start importing some of the module. We have seen how this socket module work, because it is the module that will just communicate between these two server and clients. And next one I want to import is OS module and time module. Let's see threading module. We have seen about the threading. Now let's get that threading into the action by making some of the threads to run the multiple processes simultaneously. So next thing I want to import is queue. So from queue I want to import this class, which is queue class. So if you see, the queue is similar to that of list. We have already learned about the data structure, that is the list, which was usually inside this code, or basically inside this square bracket. You can simply put any element inside this queue. So basically this is the list, but if you see, this list is unordered. That means you can just get every element from this list. You can see that you can just get these two elements from these indexes of the list, but in the case of queue this is not possible. That is only difference between the list and a queue. So in the case of list, you can access every element, but in the queue you can access only the end of the element. That is because it starts with first in first out basis. That means you can only insert to the beginning and basically get out the element from the last. You cannot access the middle element in the case of queue. Just remember that you can only insert to the last, and you can insert basically to the last here, and you can only get these element out from the queue one at a time. So that is basically the difference between the queue and the list. It is quite similar in the case of processing, only you cannot access the middle element in the case of queue. So let's see, first thing I want to make is the threads. So I want the two threads to be running simultaneously. And let's say job. So let's say jobs will be one at a time. So I'll just make a list 1 or 2. There will be 2 jobs that will be created, so that will be stored in this list. So it is only the jobs. So let me just remove spaces from here. So next thing I want to make is instantiate this queue, because we want to run this queue to make our job, or basically to execute our job. Now we have just instantiated that queue. Let's make the array addresses. This is very important, because we have to now capture these addresses in the form of list. These addresses, or basically these addresses, will be of the client, which will be our window machine. So there can be multiple clients that want to connect to this server. That means we have to make this list, because there may be many connections. So let's see, another will be our connection, because there is addresses, there will be multiple connection even. So let's see, this should be also the list. Now let's make our host. So host will be single host, that is the IP addresses of this Kali machine. So you can also get your IP addresses by simply going over here, and let me just type ifconfig. So I have already typed ifconfig, and you could see this is my IP address right here. So you have to just type your IP address in this field, which is string host. So next thing is the port I want to listen. So I want to listen in 4444 port. So next thing I want to do is the buff, which is the maximum characters that it can receive. It will be 1204 bytes, which is 1 MB. So the next thing is to create the function. So let's see how we can just create the function. If you remember what we have learned about the anonymous function or a lambda function in the packet or unpacking argument section, or basically in the function section of the basic Python lectures, then you could see we can simply create the lambda function without the definition. So let me just close this one. So what we can do is we'll say first the decode UTF. So if you are using the version that is the Python version that is 2.7, you do not need to do this. But if you are using the newer version from maybe 3.5 plus, then you have to just call this function first. So let's make this lambda function, which is anonymous function, and I have to pass argument which is data to this function, and we'll just decode this because this function is going to just decode. So I'll just decode it with UTF-8. So this is the function to just return decoded UTF-8. So let's make another function, and this will just return the string with quotes removed. So we'll just need this in the long run, so we'll just make here, because this will be also the lambda function. So I'll just pass this string which will be argument to this function, and I'll just replace. So what I'm going to do here is I'll just replace now with this double quote. Let me just give this escape, and again this. So what I really mean here is these escape characters will identify that this is to just remove or replace. So if there is a double quote, I want to just replace with this nothing, or basically with the empty string. So if you want to just remove this escape character, that is not going to work because this will not be included inside this string. So you can see that this is now the invalid string. So if you want to just include double quote inside your string, you have to give this escape character. So now we have included that inside our string. Now next thing is to create more functions. So let's see what next we can just create. So first of all, let me create a function that will just send the data. So what I really mean is this function, which is send function. We have seen the layer of our socket programming API call, and this was the same function. So what this function is going to do is this is going to send the data based on the connection that is sent. So if you see here, we haven't made the connection object yet. We'll just make this in a minute, but this is the function that is going to send the data. So next, you can just see that next function will be obviously to receive the data, and the data will be received, let me say buffer, and here you have to make use of connection object again. So I'll just say con. So connection is basically the connection that is done by the socket module. So we'll do that in a minute. We have already seen that how to just connect in the previous lecture. So that will be exact what we are doing in a minute now. So first of all, instead of just making everything right over here, let me call one method. So quick method. This will be method that will receive the large amount of data. So let's make that function. So I'll say that is receive, and receive is already created over here. So let me say receive all. So this is the function that is going to get large amount of data, so in the form of buffer. So I'll just say byte data, and this is the way to get the byte data. So now we have included the byte data. So let me say it is byte data. Now let's accept that buffer. So in order to accept that buffer, let me just make a while loop, and this is the continuous loop because the data can be come continuously. That means we have to make use of that loop, and I'll just take the part of that data. So first of all, we'll just take that part which is using this method, receive method, that we just created over here. And the next thing is I want to check the length, because I want to just get that data length in order to just send the byte or part of the data. So first of all, if I check the part, and if that part is complete buffer, so what we are doing here is to return everything that is inserted and not to just get only part. So we'll just return that is byte part. Else, in the else part, you have to just concatenate that, because we are not getting everything over here if this byte part is basically not the buffer that we sent here. That means this is not complete the data, or basically this byte part is not complete. That means we have to make byte data as a part of that data. Basically what happens here is you will just receive that data and we are just checking if that is the part or whole. If it is the whole, which is done right here by checking that if that data is a whole or if that part we received is whole, then we'll just return that by part or byte part. If that is not whole, we'll just concatenate to make it as a whole, and now we'll just see again if that is again whole or not. So again let's check with the same statement as before. If that byte data now that we concatenate is whole or not, in order to check if it is complete data or not, we have to check with this buffer that we sent, and if it is the case, then we'll just return again that byte data. So we have now created this receive all method. Now let's start making our socket. So let's go down here and let's start making our socket programming. So first method I want to make is create socket. So this will be method we have already seen how to use the socket. So first of all I'll just say global object of socket. So this will be global object, or basically this will be global variable, that is it will be visible all in part of this file. So it is only not a local, that means it won't only be visible inside this function. This object socket can be also accessed outside of this function because this is global. So let's make our try catch block, because there is going to be socket error if we don't connect it correctly. So first is I want to just get that object of socket. So you know how to create that socket object is through this socket. Now we have created this socket. So let's add some of these optional parameter to the socket. So I'll just say object socket and set and it should be set sock option. So in this option I want to give now first option, that is socket dot sol, and that is SQL socket, and this is a part of IPv4 we have already seen in the previous lecture. So the next argument that I want to give is reuse address argument. So this will be the next argument, and the last one would be the integer or the byte. I want to give value 1. So if you see here, what we just did was we just used this address if it was not connected properly. So this was the argument that was going to do for us. So the next thing what you need to do is just catch if there is an exception or not. So if there is an exception, that is going to be your error, or okay, error, and I'll just take that error and I'll just alias it string error. So there will be the error, and what you need to do is simply print that error if there is wrong in connection. So I'll just say error creating sockets, because there is exception and this is going to give us the information. We'll just concatenate it our string, and that should be string error. That should be string error. So what we just did over here was we just connected our socket. So we just made this program in order to create the socket. So next thing what you need to do is make a socket bind. So socket bind is very important, and we haven't learned about the socket bind in the previous lecture. Let's define it and we'll learn it how we can just bind that socket. So if you check the documentation of this socket module, you will see that we have the socket bind, which will just accept the IPv4 address family in the form of your host and the port. You could see we have now created that host and a port, which is this string host, and the port that this server will listen to. So we'll just pass to this address family. So that is the main use of this bind. So I'll just say object socket, and now what I need to do is again this try catch block, because there can be also the error, same error. So I'll just say print first. Okay, let's go again here, and the first thing I want to do is I want to just say that listening on port, because now we have already connected to that socket. That means we have to listen to the port, and I'll just connect it with maybe int port. So this was the port that we just defined right here, which was 4444. So it will just give us a message if there is any connection. So next thing is to bind. So I'll just take that object socket and I'll just bind it with the tuple, and the tuple here will be your str host, and next thing will be int port, which is our port. So this bind is basically the address family representative, and this will basically take the form into the tuple of our port and the host. So next thing is to call the listen, and I'll say 20 second, and the next thing is to catch that exception. So I'll just copy this because it will be similar. I'll just copy it over here and I'll just paste it here. So if there is a error, so instead of just printing error creating socket, now it will be error binding socket, and we'll just get that error. We'll just say that again socket bind should be called again, which is the same method. This method should be called if there is error binding that socket. So now we have also created that socket bind. So next method I want to create is socket accept. So this will be important method because this will get our connection established between the server and a client. So the last method over here is socket accept. So the last method of the socket family. So here what you need to do is I'll just make a complete loop, or basically infinite loop. So as before, there can be error. So in order to catch that socket error, we'll just make some connection first. So let me just make a space. So it is very important because if you just accept any connection, then you will just get the two thing over there. First is the connection, and next one is the address, which will be done by this object socket. So after that you will just accept that socket. So you could see we have this object socket global here. So if there is a connection established, it will just get us this connection and the address that this is established with. So next thing what I need to do is I'll just say connection dot set blocking, because after the connection is there, I don't want the timeout. So I'll just put here 1, and this is basically for no timeout. So next thing I want to do is I want now, if you just remember what we have just created here, that this, so queue and threads are basically for the threading part. We'll just cover this in the next lecture, but now you can see the next thing we just created was these two fields. So these two were the list. So there was array addresses and array connection. So this is the two list which represents if there is any connection, that means this should have some clients added to it. So let's go here, because we have now created a socket accept definition. That means we have to now add that connections, which is with this because there is a connection now, so we have to add that array to the connection. So next thing what you need to do is we'll just get the client info. Client info is basically the info that is the connection, or basically the information that it is connected with. So if you see, decode UTF was the function that we just created right here, the lambda function that is going to decode our data. So this is important because if you do not decode it, it is not going to work in the Python newer version. So first of all you have to decode it. So what we are going to decode is the receive buffer. So we have created this receive function also in order to receive, and you know how to receive the data because we have seen in the first lecture of this section to receive the data from the client, which is with this receive method. So in the receive, what we are going to do is we are going to get the tuple. So let's see how this is going to do. So first of all I'll say int buff, which is the data that we are going to get, and after that I want to just split with this split method of the string. So I'll just say split, and here let me just say that I want to split maybe a comma with a comma, and with maybe the one apostrophe. Okay, we want to split with this because we want to just get that data or client info, and each of these client info will have distinguished between this. So it can be maybe Windows 10 and the basically the information about that Windows server, which will be some characters. So that information will be stored in this client info, and we'll just split each of this info with these characters or a symbol. So next thing is very important because we have to now get the addresses. So let's get that address. So in order to get that address, first we have to just use this client info, and this is basically the list. So the first part in this client info will be your list, and next thing I want is the second, or basically this part, and let me say that is client info second part, because there will be maybe three information. So there will be three addresses over here. So next thing is to append to that array addresses that we just created over here, which was this array addresses. So what we are just aiming over here is, first of all, we just create the socket, that is the connection. Second is binding that to our port and IP addresses. Third one is to socket accept, that means we'll just accept all the connection that is going to just have as an incoming connection. And the next thing is we want to just accept everything as an incoming connection that is coming to the server. So in order to do that, we have to just append now to these addresses, and that is with this address that we just captured. So now what we did was we just get the connection. Let me just give some information to the user saying I have some connections, or let me say /n first, and I want to append this with connection has been established, and I'll just get the information is 0, and let me just grab here is 1. So we'll just format this. You know how to format. It is using this format keyword, and if you want to format here, then it should be with the address that is 0 and 2. Address 0, and the next one would be address 2. So what we just did over here was we just formatted, so nothing big over here, because it is saying that connection has established between these elements, which is obviously the client, and this address 2 will be the server information, which is this IP address of this server. So let's go down. Now it's time to catch that exception that we just saw here. Though I'll just say okay, except, and that will be your socket error. So socket dot error. If there is any error, then let me just go over here. If there is any error, I want to just print the message saying, let's go over here again. I'll just say error accepting connections. Just give this. Now this will be the message, and I'll just say continue, do nothing. I'll just skip over here. So these are the some method, which is the methods of the socket address family. You can see what we just did over here. We just receive all the data. We just get the socket binded and socket exception. That means in order to see if there is any socket connection between the server and client. So in the next lecture, we'll make use of the multi-threading, and we'll just make use of the client data to see the connection. We'll make all the backdoor in the upcoming lecture. See you in the next one.